And first of all, I'd like to introduce a good friend, Dr. Clifford Hill, who has a long and distinguished career, both as an academic sociologist and as a minister on the ground in North and East London. And he is going to be talking to us for 20 minutes or so about the Wilberforce legacy in relation to the experience of slavery and of black people in this country. Cliff, you're very welcome.
I find this a very exciting project. I've lived in this kind of area and worked in this sort of community the whole of my working life. We were in Tottenham for 10 years, and then we were in the East End of London in Newham for many years, and then finally living in Lambeth, where I was on the staff at St Mark's, Kennington. So we've always been involved in the community, in a multi-racial, of course, kind of community as this is. And I think this is a wonderful and exciting project. I wish you very much goodwill for it. This coming to this area is also exciting for me because this is the home territory, of course, of William Wilberforce, just up the road here. His home, one time before he was married, he shared with Henry Thornton on Clapham Common, and it became the kind of headquarters for the abolitionists in that period throughout the latter part of the 18th century and early part of the 19th century. So that Clapham historically has made a tremendous contribution to not just to British history, but really to world history. And I'm going to talk about Wilberforce this afternoon and relating his life and work to contemporary issues. God Almighty has set before me two great objects: the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners. Now, this well-known diary entry from William Wilberforce neatly expresses his life's work, but it also underlines his strong religious faith and his Christian convictions. Soon after the spiritual experience that changed his life, he began a kind of lifelong practice of self-examination, which I find very interesting, and I'm sure you will too. This is expressed in numerous of his lengthy diary entries. One of the first of these entries, as a young man, early in his parliamentary career, this is on the 25th of June, 1786. He wrote in his diary this: "I do not think I have a sufficiently strong conviction of sin. Yet I see plainly that I am an ungrateful, stupid, guilty creature. I believe that Christ died for all such who would throw themselves on him, renouncing every claim of their own and relying on his assurance of free pardon, that might be reconciled to God and receive the free gift of the Holy Spirit to renew them after the image of God in righteousness and true holiness. And I hope in time to find such a change in me." Now, Wilberforce resolved to change the morals of the nation, an amazing task. And in 1802, he established the Society for the Suppression of Vice, which Sidney Smith, who was no friend of his, described as the Society for the Suppression of Vice with those of less than £500 a year. This was shortly before the death shortly after, I should say, the death of John Wesley, whose ministry had had a transforming effect upon the lives of thousands of men and women in the working classes. and was spreading rapidly through the Methodist movement, again, which mainly reached the working classes. But by contrast, Wilberforce believed that God had called him to reach deep into the ranks of the ruling classes. So Sidney Smith's jibe was probably more perceptive and complimentary than he actually intended. But there can be no doubt that it was Wilberforce's tenacity and persistence that achieved the success of the long-running parliamentary campaign, first to achieve the abolition of the slave trade, and then finally to see his work, his life's work, crowned with the success of passing the Abolition Act the Act of Emancipation in 1833. And that abolished slavery throughout the British Empire. Now, there can be no doubt that it was his Christian faith, believing that all human beings are created in the image of God, and that all human beings are equal before God. It was this conviction, really, that drove Wilberforce, motivated him. Wilberforce was no longer in Parliament, though no longer active in Parliament, in the years leading up to the passing of the 1833 Act. Or there is no doubt in my mind that he would have opposed the terms of settlement, which paid £20 million of taxpayers' money to the owners of slaves in compensation for the loss of their property. Now, this is equivalent to more than £1 billion in today's money. But the outrageous thing is that absolutely nothing, not one penny, was paid to the slaves themselves in compensation for them or their forebears having been taken from Africa and subjected to a lifetime of cruelty, plus the loss of identity, culture, language, freedom, and personal dignity. Now, in 2007, that was the time of the abolition of the slave trade, the 200th anniversary of the abolition of the slave trade, in 2007, Walden Media, a Hollywood film production company, produced a film, rather they released a film on the 200th anniversary. It was called Amazing Grace, and it portrayed Wilberforce and his friends as the heroes of a great struggle of righteousness against iniquity. Some months before the release of this film, they laid on a preview in London at a London cinema, and they invited comments from both black and white community leaders. Well, I was one of those present, and in my report, I did point out some of the outstanding historical inaccuracies, as well as other comments and commendations. But here's the interesting thing, that most of the white people there were strongly emotionally affected and reacted favourably to the film. All those I spoke to after the film thought that it successfully portrayed the persistence of Wilberforce in the face of entrenched and powerful opposition, from those, of course, with vested interests in the trade. It depicted the triumph of persistence in the face of constant defeat, and the triumph of truth over lies and of righteousness over evil. So the white people in that, all the ones I was able to speak to, all thought that the film was great. But the reaction of the black people to whom I spoke was in sharp contrast. They were unhappy that the film majored upon the white heroes and did not show any of the role played by Africans themselves in the abolition. It made no mention of the riots in the colonies and the bravery and suffering and the martyrdom, indeed, of many of those who dared to oppose slavery. The film totally ignored the contribution of the slaves themselves to the achievement of their freedom, which made the institution of slavery increasingly unprofitable and unsustainable. From an African perspective, the film applauded the work of a small group of privileged, aristocratic philanthropists who succeeded in bringing a small measure of justice to helpless blacks. Triumphantly marching to the tune of Amazing Grace, those of you who saw the film will remember this, no doubt, was deeply offensive to the black people in the audience. It gave the impression that slavery had been defeated in 1807, whereas in fact it lasted another 31 years in the Caribbean islands. And it was only, because it was only the trade itself that was stopped in 1807. And moreover, slavery itself was not abolished then, and there was still a huge amount of slavery, and there's still a huge amount of slavery today. Slavery has never been abolished in the world. White Christians feel guilty that it was white people who so cruelly oppressed black people, but glad that a group of white Christians set them free. Black people instinctively react negatively towards patronage, however kindly meant. What they're looking for is justice in the present and compensation of the past. Now, this is something that the British government will not grant or even discuss. And this is why in 2007, the celebrations of the 200th anniversary of the abolition of the slave trade, Tony Blair persistently refused to make any apology for British involvement in colonial slavery. Both black and white communities need to recognize that 200 years ago we were on different sides. That cannot be changed. We cannot rewrite history, but we can recognize the enormity of the injustice suffered by African Caribbean people. We can recognize the enormous contribution that the slaves made to their own emancipation, and that the cruel death of so many of them that they suffered was not in vain. We can recognize also that there is still a legacy of slavery that is social, cultural, and economic today. White people need to say to their black brothers and sisters, once we were on different sides, but now we're on the same side. We need to join hands in the fight against poverty, injustice, and oppression. Cugiano, Toussaint, Louverture, and Moseni, Christopher, Dessalines, Pellier, and Goman, Julian Fedon, Padilla and Romero, Jordan and Sharp, Mary Prince, Bissett, and Pori Papi, Petition and Butho, and countless other black activists, rebels and abolitionists who suffered and gave their lives, without which the challenge to colonial slavery could not have succeeded. Now, after abolition, the Caribbean islands dropped out of focus here in Britain. The abolitionists felt that their job was done, and they expected the newly freed African Caribbeans not only to enjoy their freedom, but to find prosperity and a new way of life. The reality was far from this. Many had to sell their labor on the sugar plantations. Others managed to obtain small parcels of land that didn't belong to any of the big estates, usually the poorest land, or on the hillsides, sides of mountains. And they became peasant farmers. Others drifted into the towns, seeking any kind of work. Poverty and suffering became endemic, and a deep sense of injustice became institutionalized. Was this the freedom for which they had struggled and so many of their countrymen had died? Now that sense of injustice is still here today, not only in the underdeveloped West Indies, which have never had any compensation from Britain, but it is here in Britain among those who have left the Caribbean for a new life here in Britain. Now, I was one of the speakers at a recent conference in City Hall, organised by the Mayor of London, to look at social conditions in the black communities in inner city boroughs. Some 300 black leaders were present, maybe some of you here were there, and a small number of white community leaders. Now, I had been asked to speak about William Wilberforce and the abolitionists. And although I was aware of the sensitivities of this subject, I was heckled at one point when I spoke about the significance of Wilberforce's parliamentary campaign. Working classes suffered under the burden of slavery in the 18th. Working class kids of 9 or 10 years old could work in the factories and mines and mills of England. This is the background to English working classes today. The cruelties they suffered at the hands of ruthless, the children suffered, the hands of ruthless masters were known as white slavery. Wilberforce used the term white slavery when he introduced the 10-hour bill in 1802. But it wasn't until the 1840s, 40 years later, that the bill preventing children working all kinds of hours, 14, 15 hours a day, in unhealthy and dangerous conditions. And this is in England with the white working classes. Now, the long, hard struggle for justice for the poor in England, who only had their labour to sell, has many links with colonial slavery. The Tolpuddle martyrs, the Peterloo massacre, the Corn riots, the suppression of the Chartists, and the scores of other violent scenes have written in the blood of the English working classes in their struggle for justice. Social ranking dominated the nation in pre-industrial England, and the social class system has controlled the distribution of power and influenced social mobility ever since then. In the 19th century Britain, only the rich were represented in Parliament, and women only achieved the vote in the lifetime of many still living in this country. 1929. Human nature has an innate sense of justice, and when this is violated and justice is denied, it leaves deep scars of resentment, which not only affect its direct victims, but they are carried down the generations. These scars of working class resentment are still here today and can be seen in working class attitudes, differences between north of England and south, and between black and white, despite all the race relations legislation. It is the legacy of colonial and industrial slavery in England that creates a common bond between young people in inner city areas of contemporary Britain. The legacy of slavery is sufficiently powerful to override territorial lines of control and allow youths of rival gangs to make common cause against the enemy who controls the oppressive system from which they all suffer. And it was the legacy of slavery that was the most powerful social factor behind the inner city riots that began in Tottenham in August 2011. If there's any doubt about this assertion, a study of the racial origins of those who were arrested as offenders gives powerful support. The overwhelming majority of those who were arrested as offenders in the riots shows that they were from the Caribbean communities and from white, low-income, white working-class families. Africans and Asians, even though highly represented in those areas, geographical areas, were not involved in statistically significant numbers. The Africans and Asians have no slavery in their genes, no legacy of slavery. And I believe there is a strong sociological case for saying that it was the legacy of slavery that united the rioters. In a study carried out by the LSE, it was concluded that in addition to the usual factors of unemployment and poverty, a strong sense of injustice was present. The study, however, failed to note the origin of this injustice, which I believe is located in slavery. The powerful social driver that unites members of hostile rival gangs, usually implacable enemies, to fight alongside each other in the common cause against injustice, is the legacy of slavery, both white and black.